The night was thick with grief. In the dimly lit corridors of an animal shelter, a mournful sound pierced the silence, one that no one could ignore. Charlie, a once proud German shepherd, lay in a corner, his mighty form reduced to a quivering shell of its former self. His deep, gut-wrenching cries echoed through the shelter, reverberating off the walls. He had been here for days, restless and broken, as though the loss he carried inside him had seeped into every inch of his being. The shelter staff had grown weary from the endless sound. This wasn't just another animal in distress. It was a heart-wrenching story waiting to unfold. One evening, as the harsh fluorescent lights flickered above Dr. Scott found himself standing beside Charlie's kennel, gently reaching out to comfort the grieving dog. The usual bright eyes that had once sparkled with intelligence and loyalty now stared back at him, clouded with an overwhelming sorrow. It was as though Charlie was waiting for something or someone to make things right. Welcome to the Heart Force channel, where you and I find more meaning in life through stories about dogs. Before we continue, please comment below and let us know where you're listening to this video from. And if you have any stories about your dog, feel free to share them with everyone. The collar around Charlie's neck caught Dr. Scott's eye, and he bent closer to inspect it. He had seen this dog many times before, but this collar, this was something new. As his fingers traced over the leather, they landed on something strange, deliberate scratches beneath the current tag. The marking seemed out of place. Curiosity ignited, and with trembling hands, he examined the tag under the bright lights. What he uncovered sent a chill down his spine. "Oh my God," he whispered, for the first time in years. The experienced veterinarian felt a wave of uncertainty. This wasn't just about a lost dog or a grieving companion. No, this discovery, this revelation, was much deeper. It was a story of sacrifice, of guilt, and of a bond between two families that had been broken by fate and hidden for 6 long years. Charlie's howls grew louder, as though acknowledging that the truth was about to come to light. In the small town of Arlington, Virginia, the Carter family had once been a picture of success and compassion. Francis Carter, a highly respected cardiac surgeon, had dedicated his life to healing. His wife, Grace, a former concert pianist, had supported his career in their shared love of animal rescue. Their daughter, Sarah, was studying medicine, unaware that her family's story was about to be transformed in a way no one could have anticipated. Meanwhile, 3 miles away, in a modest townhouse, lived Emily Harrington. A trauma counselor by profession, Emily was no stranger to pain. Her life had been defined by loss, but it was one loss, one tragic night, that would forever bind her fate to Charlie's. 6 years ago, she had everything: a flourishing career, a beautiful home, and her beloved German shepherd. But one rainy October evening changed everything. An accident left her with a shattered heart and a terrible burden of guilt. It was a night that would haunt her forever. She had fled the scene, believing she had killed her dog. The truth, however, was far from what Emily imagined. The story of the accident, of Charlie's rescue, and of a choice made by a man who had dedicated his life to healing, would soon emerge. A story that would heal wounds and mend broken relationships in ways no one could have foreseen. The morning sun filtered through the trees, casting long shadows across the Carter estate. Francis stood at the kitchen window, watching Charlie perform his morning patrol, an unwavering, meticulous routine. The once proud German shepherd, now graying and weathered, had earned Francis's trust, and in return, Charlie had become the heart of their home. That morning, however, something felt different. Francis had spent the previous night reviewing medical records, digging through decades of patient files. Among them was a name that caught his attention: Emily Harrington. The name belonged to the woman who had once been the driver in the accident that had changed everything. Francis knew he had to make a decision, but the weight of the truth was overwhelming. As the quiet morning turned to afternoon, the soft breeze carrying the scent of autumn through the open windows, Francis made a promise to Charlie. "I'll be back for our walk, old friend," he said. patting the dog's head. Little did either of them know this would be their last goodbye. Minutes later, the screech of tires shattered the stillness. Francis's car swerved sharply to avoid a child chasing a ball. The vehicle veered off course, directly into a massive oak tree. The impact was brutal, throwing Francis into unconsciousness. Charlie, sensing the gravity of the moment, sprang into action. The dog stood guard by Francis's side, refusing to leave even as paramedics rushed to help. Despite the frantic efforts of the medical team, Francis's condition worsened. In his last moments, he whispered one name to his wife, Grace, Emily. The shelter was eerily quiet as Grace arrived with Charlie 2 weeks after the funeral. It was as though the dog had absorbed every ounce of their shared grief, leaving him hollow, a ghost of the once joyful companion. He hadn't eaten in days, and his eyes, once full of life, now seemed clouded with a deep, unshakable sorrow. Grace had tried everything she could to comfort him, but she was losing hope. It felt like she was betraying Francis's memory by bringing Charlie to the shelter, but she had no choice. The dog needed more than she could offer. "I can't do this anymore," she whispered as she gently placed Charlie's belongings in a bag. His favorite toy, a blanket, a food bowl engraved with his name. Every item seemed to carry the weight of Francis's absence. But she had to let go. The decision was too hard to bear. As she reached for the leash, Charlie's head dropped, his tail wagging for the first time in days. It was as if he understood, as though he was waiting for something more than the shelter's cold walls. The Arlington Animal Shelter, a place of refuge for many animals, stood as a silent witness to the pain that had been carried through the Carter family. Dr. James Scott had seen countless cases of grief, but there was something different about Charlie. The dog's mourning wasn't just physical. It seemed to be a reflection of something deeper, something that in time would unravel in ways Dr. Scott could never have anticipated. When Grace handed over Charlie's collar, a sense of unease washed over Dr. Scott. The tag seemed wrong. It didn't belong to this dog, not entirely. Beneath the worn and scratched tag, a hidden inscription caught his attention. With trembling hands, Dr. Scott carefully examined the engraving. The discovery would send him on a journey that would bring two families together, a journey that would heal them all in ways they never thought possible. For Dr. Scott, this wasn't just another case. This was a story of healing, of redemption, and of love, a love that had endured 6 years of silence. And as Charlie's mournful cries echoed through the shelter, it became clear that the past had come to claim them all. 3 days after Charlie arrived at the shelter, the howls had stopped. The silence that followed was just as unsettling. Dr. Scott couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. The dog had stopped crying, but his eyes, those sad, intelligent eyes, still held an unspoken plea. It was as though Charlie was waiting, almost as if he were sensing the unraveling of something larger than himself. Dr. Scott had spent countless hours reviewing Francis's notes on Charlie's condition. But it wasn't the medical charts that kept him up at night. It was the hidden message buried in the dog's collar. The inscription he had discovered that revealed a story so tangled. It seemed like a puzzle with pieces scattered across time. One late evening, while the shelter was quiet, Dr. Scott sat at his desk, reviewing Charlie's medical history for the umpteenth time. The gaps in the records intrigued him. There was a 6-year stretch between Charlie's last visits to the clinic and the time he was brought in by the Carters. A missing link, a mystery waiting to be solved. Charlie's constant howling had shifted from a cry of grief to something more urgent, more desperate. It was as if the dog knew the truth was on the verge of discovery. As the shadows of the night stretched long and the wind rattled the windows, Dr. Scott couldn't ignore the pull to investigate further. He needed to know. That's when the name appeared on his screen. Emily Harrington. The story began to take shape in a way that Dr. Scott hadn't expected. Emily had been a patient at the hospital where Francis had worked. Her son, Thomas, had been the care of Francis years ago. But there was more to the story, much more. The gaps were no longer mere coincidences. They were pieces of a puzzle that needed to be connected. Dr. Scott spent the rest of the night tracing Emily's name through the local veterinary records. As dawn approached, everything clicked into place. 6 years ago, Emily had posted missing dog posters all over Arlington, searching for a German shepherd named Charlie. The dates matched perfectly. The same Charlie, the same dog. Dr. Scott's hands shook as he leaned back in his chair. He had uncovered something that no one else knew, not even Grace. This wasn't just about a dog that had been lost and found. This was about two families connected by tragedy, a night that had forever altered the course of their lives. But why had Francis kept this a secret? Why hadn't he contacted Emily, let alone tell his wife Grace the truth? The answer had to lie in the letter Francis had mentioned in his final moments, the one he had entrusted to Grace to open only when the time was right. As the morning light began to stream through the window, Dr. Scott made a decision. He needed to confront Grace, to ask for her permission to pursue this investigation further. But there was a deeper question he needed to answer. How could he tell her the truth? The next morning, Grace walked into the shelter with a heavy heart. It had been a difficult few weeks since Francis's passing. She had tried to move forward, to heal, but she found herself stuck in the house, surrounded by memories of the man she had loved. Charlie, too, had become a reminder of everything she had lost. When Grace arrived at the shelter, Dr. Scott could see the sadness in her eyes, the deep well of grief that seemed to weigh on her every movement. It was clear that she had been struggling with her decision to bring Charlie here. But there was something else, something unspoken. "I found this," Grace said, holding out the worn leather briefcase that had belonged to Francis. "While I was cleaning his study." With trembling hands, she opened the briefcase, revealing a collection of photographs, medical documents, and a journal, Francis's personal journal. As Dr. Scott examined the documents, he found something that startled him. Among the pictures were photographs of a young boy, Thomas Harrington, and a dog, a German shepherd, Charlie. But it wasn't just the pictures that caught Dr. Scott's attention. It was the date stamps. These photos were from 6 years ago, the same time Charlie had disappeared. Grace watched Dr. Scott's reaction closely. "What is it?" she asked, her voice breaking with a mixture of fear and curiosity. Dr. Scott remained silent, his mind racing as he pieced the story together. Francis had been hiding the truth all along. He had known. He had known who Charlie belonged to. And he had known that Emily Harrington, the woman who had once posted missing dog flyers all over Arlington, had lost Charlie that night. Grace's eyes filled with tears as she stared at the photos. "Why didn't he tell me? Why didn't he tell me the truth?" Dr. Scott gently placed the photos aside and turned to face her. "I believe Francis was protecting you, Grace. And Emily. And Charlie. He couldn't bear to tell you the truth because he knew how much it would hurt. But now, the truth was undeniable. Charlie's story was connected to Emily's, and the secrets that had kept them apart for so long were finally beginning to unravel. The next few days at the shelter were a blur. Grace couldn't stop thinking about the photos, the letter, and the weight of everything Francis had carried alone. As the hours passed, a mixture of disbelief and deep sadness settled in her heart. She couldn't fathom why Francis, a man so dedicated to healing, had chosen to keep this monumental secret. Dr. Scott had carefully read through the journal entries from Francis, and the picture they painted was clearer than ever. Francis had known the whole time. He had known who Charlie truly was, and he had made the difficult decision to hide that truth for the sake of Emily's healing, as well as for his own family's peace. The journal entries describe how Francis had found Charlie that fateful night, injured and alone. He had recognized the dog immediately, not just as any stray, but as Emily's beloved companion. But what really struck Dr. Scott was the sheer tenderness with which Francis had cared for Charlie, as if he knew that the dog was not just in need of physical healing, but emotional healing as well. And then there was Emily, the guilt that had haunted her for years, the search that had been fruitless, the overwhelming sense of failure. These were the burdens she had carried. Not knowing that Charlie had been right under her nose, cared for by the one man she had trusted to heal her son. But Emily had also unknowingly become a part of the story, a story she had no idea was unfolding around her. The morning after Grace had left the shelter, Dr. Scott sat alone in his office, staring at Charlie's collar. He had spent hours studying the photos, piecing together the history of Charlie's life, and now the truth was finally clear. Emily had been searching for her dog all these years, convinced he was lost forever. But Charlie wasn't lost. He had been cared for by Frances, hidden from her to protect her from the overwhelming guilt that would have torn her apart. Dr. Scott knew that the time had come to bring everything to light. The letter from Frances was clear. The truth could no longer be hidden. It was time to bring the families together. But it wasn't just about Charlie's health anymore. It was about healing wounds that had been buried for far too long. The drive to Emily's townhouse was long and quiet. Dr. Scott's heart raced as he neared her home. It had been years since he had seen her, since the night when her son had been in critical condition, and Frances had performed the surgery that saved his life. The weight of the history between them was heavy, but Dr. Scott knew that this was the only way forward. He parked in front of Emily's townhouse and walked up to the door, knocking softly. She answered quickly, her face pale and tired, but there was a hint of recognition in her eyes. "Dr. Scott, what's going on? Is Charlie?" She began, her voice shaking with anxiety. Dr. Scott held up his hand gently, stopping her. "It's about Charlie. I need to show you something." He handed her the leather briefcase that had once belonged to Frances. Emily hesitated, then took it from him, her fingers trembling as she opened it. She pulled out the journal, the photos, and the letters, each one a part of the story she had never known. "I don't understand," Emily whispered, her eyes scanning the pages. "Why didn't he tell me? Why didn't Frances tell me?" Dr. Scott looked at her, his voice soft but firm. "Frances knew, Emily. He knew who Charlie was all along. He was protecting you, and he was protecting Charlie. He didn't want to hurt you, not after everything you had been through with your son. He thought that if you knew the truth, it would destroy you." Emily's hands shook as she turned the pages of the journal. Her eyes widened with each new revelation. "But he never told me. He was hiding him all these years." "Yes," Dr. Scott replied. "He kept Charlie's original identity a secret. He knew that if you found out the truth, it would destroy you. But now, the truth has to come to light. We can't keep hiding." Emily sank into a chair, overwhelmed by the weight of the discovery. "All these years, I've been looking for him, and he was right here. I could have had him back, but I didn't know. I didn't know he was safe." "I know," Dr. Scott said quietly. "But now we can make it right. Charlie has been waiting for this moment, too. It's time for healing for both you and Charlie." As they sat there, the doorbell rang. Dr. Scott turned to find Grace standing in the doorway, her face pale but resolute. "I think it's time," she said, her voice steady but tinged with emotion. The drive to the veterinary hospital was a blur of emotions. Grace sat in the front seat, her hand resting on the seat next to her, while Emily sat behind, looking out the window, lost in thought. The weight of the truth hung heavy in the car, but there was also a sense of something else, a glimmer of hope. They arrived at the hospital, and, as they entered the waiting room, they could see Charlie resting in a quiet corner. His once proud form was now diminished, but there was something different in his eyes, something that spoke of understanding, of knowing that the time had come for the families to be reunited. Dr. Scott stood by the door, watching them approach. He had seen many miracles in his years as a veterinarian, but this was something more. This wasn't just about treating a dog's physical wounds. This was about healing the deep emotional scars that had marked both families. As they approached Charlie, the dog lifted his head, his eyes locking with Emily's. For the first time in years, Charlie's tail gave a weak wag. The bond between them was undeniable. "You're here," Emily whispered, tears welling in her eyes as she knelt beside him. The moment Charlie's tail flicked gently, a subtle wave of relief passed through the room. Emily leaned closer, her hands trembling as she reached out to gently touch his fur. The weight of the last 6 years, the guilt, the searching, the unanswered questions, seemed to lift in that instant. She had found Charlie, but more than that, she had found a beginning of something much greater: redemption, healing, forgiveness. Grace stood beside her, her face etched with years of sorrow. Yet in her eyes was a quiet strength. This was the moment she had feared and longed for, the moment when the truth would break open the dam of grief and set them free. It wasn't just Charlie who needed healing, it was all of them. The pain they carried, the secrets they hid, could only be washed away by the truth. Charlie, Emily whispered, her voice thick with emotion, I'm so sorry. The tears she had never allowed herself to shed now flowed freely as she buried her face in the dog's fur. Charlie nudged her gently with his nose, as if to say, it's okay. The dog who had once been lost and broken was now offering the kind of forgiveness that only animals seemed capable of, unconditional, unwavering. Dr. Scott watched quietly from the doorway, feeling the weight of the moment. He had seen many dogs come through his clinic, but none like Charlie. The German Shepherd wasn't just a patient. He was a bridge between families, between trauma and healing, between the past and the future. Charlie had witnessed it all, from the accident to the moments of loss and healing that had followed. And now, in this very room, he was helping mend the brokenness that had plagued them all. I think he knows, Grace said softly, her voice cracking as she knelt beside Emily. He knows we're finally together. Emily looked up, wiping her tears. I never thought this day would come. I spent so many nights thinking I had failed him, thinking I had lost him forever. But here we are. She looked at Dr. Scott, then at Grace. Thank you. Thank you for bringing us all together. Dr. Scott nodded. It was Francis's wish that this day would come. That's why he kept everything from you, to protect you. He knew the truth would be too much, but he also knew that eventually, this would be the only way forward. The room was quiet, save for Charlie's steady breathing. The German Shepherd, despite his frail state, had shown the strength to carry his family's burdens. His spirit had endured the weight of loss, and now, together, they could start the journey of healing. Grace gently placed her hand on Emily's shoulder. We've been given a second chance, haven't we? Yes, Emily replied, her voice filled with newfound resolve. A second chance to make things right, to heal the past and move forward. They stood in silence for a long moment, each one processing the weight of their shared history. Charlie lay between them, his breathing steady, his tail thumping softly against the floor. In his quiet presence, they all found a sense of peace. Later that evening, after Charlie had been settled in his special room at the veterinary hospital, Grace and Emily sat together in the family room, surrounded by the photographs, letters, and medical files Francis had left behind. The silence that had once been filled with unspoken grief now seemed full of understanding. They were no longer just two women bound by a dog. They were two women bound by love, forgiveness, and a shared desire to heal. As Grace flipped through the journal, she found herself reading a passage Francis had written on the night of the accident. Love isn't just the bond between a man and his wife, or a parent and child. It's the force that carries us through the hardest times, that connects us even when we feel lost. It's the kind of love that mends broken hearts, even when we don't know how it works. I've seen it in Charlie's eyes. I've seen it in Emily's heart. And I know that one day, love will find its way back to all of us. Tears filled Grace's eyes as she looked at Emily. Francis knew. He always knew. Yes, Emily whispered, wiping her tears. He was preparing us all along. The story of Charlie is a story of love, sacrifice, and the unbreakable bonds that hold us together. Even when we think we are broken, sometimes it takes years to unravel the secrets we hide from ourselves and each other. But the truth has a way of surfacing, and when it does, healing can begin. Charlie's journey is a reminder that no matter how lost we feel, no matter how broken our past may be, there is always a chance for redemption, forgiveness, and a second chance at love. What did you think of this story and the way love and healing brought these families back together? We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe to the Heart Force channel for more inspirational stories about dogs that show us how powerful love and healing can truly be. It was an ordinary sunny afternoon when something extraordinary happened. No one could have known that the event about to unfold would leave the entire town of Sterling Heights grappling with questions of dignity, sacrifice, and the true meaning of heroism. David Dumayer, a decorated Army veteran, walked into Jeepers restaurant with his service dog, Layla, a German Shepherd trained to help him with his daily life after a traumatic injury in Afghanistan. David had been through battles on foreign soil, but this would be a different kind of fight, one he never saw coming. He had a promise to keep, a promise to Michael Anderson, a fallen soldier and his best friend, to always be there for Emily, Michael's daughter. But this birthday celebration, one that should have been full of joy, was about to shatter everything David had fought for. David stood tall, despite the years of scars both visible and invisible. His prosthetic leg was a testament to the fight he had endured, a badge of honor he never asked for but wore nonetheless. Layla, his constant companion, stood beside him, her calm demeanor an anchor to the reality he fought to maintain in a world that often fell out of reach. Emily Anderson, who had grown up calling David uncle, was celebrating her 7th birthday at the very restaurant that would soon become the stage for a drama no one could have predicted. As she spotted David and Layla entering, a wide smile broke across her face, and she rushed to greet him, unaware that her party would soon take a dramatic turn. "Uncle David's here," Emily shouted, her voice bright and full of excitement, drawing the attention of the entire restaurant. The joyful atmosphere shifted subtly as patrons glanced over, their eyes lingering a little too long on the pair. "Welcome to Heart Force, where you and I find more meaning in life through stories about dogs." Before we continue, please comment below and let us know where you are listening to this video from. And if you have any stories about your dog, feel free to share them with everyone. David's heart swelled as he watched Emily open her presents, her small hands carefully unwrapping the gift he had painstakingly prepared, a photo album full of memories of her father, Michael. But before the joy could fully settle in, something shifted in the room. A woman at a nearby table, dressed in an expensive beige suit, looked over at David and Layla with growing concern. Karen Mitchell, a grandmother, sat with her family, clearly uncomfortable as she watched the dog. As the minutes passed, the unease among the diners began to spread. David could feel the tension mounting. It was a familiar feeling, one he had experienced many times in public spaces. Curious stares, whispers, and the ever-present judgment of people who couldn't understand the depth of his need for Layla's presence. But David kept his focus. He couldn't afford to let his guard down. Not now. Not here. As Emily finished opening her presents, the sounds of the restaurant grew louder, and the laughter of children mixed with a murmur of uncomfortable conversations. Then it happened. The manager, Sarah Martinez, approached the table with a polite but firm look on her face. "Mr. Dumayer," she began, her voice steady but with an undercurrent of tension. "Can I speak with you for a moment?" David looked up at her, his heart racing. "Is something wrong?" he asked, his tone cautious. "There have been some concerns raised by other customers about your dog," Sarah explained, gesturing toward Layla. "I'm sorry, but I'm going to have to ask you to leave." David's stomach sank. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. He had been to this restaurant many times before, always with Layla, always respectful of the rules. The Americans with Disabilities Act clearly allowed him to have his service dog with him. And yet, in this moment, none of that seemed to matter. The very essence of who he was, the promise to Michael, the sacrifices he had made, was being dismissed as though it were inconsequential. The room fell silent. All eyes were on David and Layla. The birthday song still echoed faintly in the background, but its cheerfulness felt like a cruel reminder of what was being taken away. David could feel his chest tightening, his emotions threatening to overtake him. "I'm sorry," Sarah continued, though her apology did little to soften the blow. "I understand your situation, but we need to consider the safety and comfort of all our guests." David took a deep breath, trying to remain calm. The anger bubbled just beneath the surface, but he knew better than to let it show. He glanced over at Emily, who was standing frozen, her big eyes filled with confusion and sadness. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, her voice trembling with the weight of her 7 years. David's heart shattered. He had promised Michael he would always be there for his daughter, that she would never feel the absence of her father on her special day. But now, he had to break that promise, at least for the moment. "I'm sorry, sweetheart," David whispered, his voice barely audible. He looked at the others at the table, all of them staring back with varying degrees of sympathy and disbelief. He could see the frustration in Sarah's eyes, the discomfort in the faces of the diners. But none of it mattered. This moment, this injustice, was about more than just a dog in a restaurant. It was about a veteran being stripped of his dignity in front of the very people he had sworn to protect. As David stood to leave, Layla pressed her body against his, sensing his distress, her training kicking in to offer the comfort he so desperately needed. Together, they turned and made their way to the door. But what happened next would change everything. David's heart pounded in his chest as he made his way out of the restaurant, the weight of the world pressing down on him with each step. Layla stayed by his side, her presence unwavering, her eyes focused on him with a calm understanding only a service dog could provide. But as they reached the door, David felt a pang of sorrow. The room he was leaving behind wasn't just a restaurant. It was a symbol of the community he had fought for, the same community that now stood divided by a simple misunderstanding. The air outside was thick with the kind of quiet that only follows moments of deep emotional impact. David felt like he was walking through a haze, the sound of the bustling mall fading into the background. Layla walked at his side, her steady pace a contrast to the storm of thoughts racing through his mind. He hadn't expected this, didn't know how to process it. As they approached the parking lot, David's phone buzzed in his pocket. It was Sarah Anderson, Emily's mother. He hesitated for a moment, unsure whether he could speak without his emotions spilling over. But when he saw Layla looking up at him, as if to remind him of his purpose, he answered. "David." Sarah's voice was soft, but there was an unmistakable steel behind her words. "I want to thank you for being there today. You didn't have to, but you kept your promise to Michael. You kept it to Emily. I won't forget that." David swallowed the lump in his throat. "It's not your fault, Sarah. I never thought something like this would happen. Not here." "David," Sarah said, her voice now carrying a sense of urgency. "You've fought for this country. You've given more than anyone could ask. We all owe you. Don't let anyone make you feel less than that." David felt a flicker of something deep within him. The guilt, the shame, the anger. He had been battling them since the incident in Afghanistan. But in that moment, Sarah's words became a lifeline, a reminder that he wasn't alone in this fight. His bond with her, with Emily, and with the entire community was stronger than any injustice he could face. The next few days were a blur. David withdrew from his usual routine, taking refuge in the silence of his apartment. Layla, as always, stayed close, offering him the comfort she had become so adept at providing. The nightmares were relentless, as they always were when the memories of war came flooding back. But each time, David awoke in a cold sweat. There was Layla, her warm brown eyes steady and understanding, as if to say, "You're not alone." Yet, the incident at the restaurant haunted him. The way people had looked at him, the way the manager had approached him with such little regard for his rights, for his humanity. He had fought for this country, lost a limb in the process, and yet here he was, humiliated in front of a group of strangers, strangers who had no idea what it meant to serve, to sacrifice. The thought made him furious. But in that fury, something stirred. The community, his community, had to understand what had happened. This wasn't just about a dog in a restaurant. This was about the sacrifices of veterans being ignored, the rights of those who had given everything for their country being trampled. A small part of David wondered if the community even understood what veterans like him went through. How many of them had ever seen the battlefield? How many of them knew what it was like to wake up in a hospital bed, missing a leg, and wonder how they were supposed to move forward? How many of them had been in situations where their lives were at risk, and in the end, They had to rely on the quiet strength of a dog to bring them back from the edge. As David pondered these questions, he knew the answer wasn't simple. But he also knew one thing: something needed to be done. Meanwhile, in the heart of Sterling Heights, the ripples of the incident at Jeepers restaurant began to spread. Word had gotten out about what had happened. Social media buzzed with opinions, some supportive of David, others siding with the concerns of the restaurant patrons. But what none of them knew was how this single moment would ignite a firestorm that would force the entire nation to confront its treatment of veterans. Back at the restaurant, the backlash had begun in the form of online complaints, calls to corporate headquarters, and soon, the media had picked up the story. The local news outlets ran stories about the veteran and his service dog being thrown out of a restaurant. Some argued it was a violation of David's rights under the Americans with Disabilities Act. Others saw it as an issue of customer comfort versus legal requirements. David hadn't seen it coming, but now there was no escaping it. The local Facebook groups were filled with debates. Some people accusing Jeepers of discrimination, others defending the business, suggesting that it was all a misunderstanding. The mayor of Sterling Heights, Robert Harrison, a Vietnam veteran, had weighed in with a strong statement on the importance of respecting veterans and their rights. Still, there was no real resolution. The community was divided, and David's personal battle became a symbol of something much larger, a struggle for understanding, empathy, and justice for those who had sacrificed so much. David sat in his living room that evening, the weight of the world pressing down on him. He had always kept to himself, tried to blend into the background, and honor the promises he had made to his fallen brothers. But now, it seemed as though he had no choice but to stand up, not just for himself, but for every veteran who had ever been dismissed or ignored. Layla sat quietly beside him, as if to remind him that he was never truly alone. This battle, he knew, was far from over. The storm that began inside Jeepers restaurant was far from over. As the media coverage of David's encounter with the restaurant spread like wildfire, the town of Sterling Heights found itself caught in a whirlwind of emotions. A simple birthday celebration had turned into a public spectacle, and now, David's name was on the lips of everyone, whether they were offering support or calling for his dismissal. For David, it felt like the world was spinning out of control. The incident had already made national headlines, with news outlets from Detroit to New York picking up the story. What was supposed to be a quiet afternoon of remembrance for Michael Anderson's daughter had become a flashpoint for a larger, unresolved issue in the community. At first, David kept to himself. He stayed in his apartment, his mind haunted by the image of Emily's tear-streaked face and the crushing weight of that one humiliating moment. Every time he closed his eyes, he could still hear the restaurant's manager, Sarah Martinez, repeating her words, "I'm sorry, sir, but you'll have to leave." But even in his isolation, David knew one thing. This couldn't just end in silence. Something had to change. If his own pain and anger could bring about a conversation, no, a reckoning about the treatment of veterans and service animals, then he would make it happen. The phone calls started flooding in, some of them supportive, others laced with anger and frustration. One call that stood out came from Commander Richard Powell, a veteran and community leader. "David, I know this is hard," Commander Powell said, his voice firm but compassionate. "But you have to stand up. You have to keep fighting. There are other veterans who need you to do this, to show them it's okay, to speak up, to demand respect." David knew what Commander Powell was saying was true. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting for every veteran who had ever felt dismissed, overlooked, or humiliated. He was fighting for the silent struggles that many, including himself, had carried for years without ever sharing. And so, the decision was made. He would speak out. The first step was reaching out to the local press. The media had already gotten hold of the story, but David knew he had to take control of the narrative. His first interview was scheduled with the Sterling Heights Gazette, and though he felt a knot of anxiety twist in his stomach, he knew it was necessary. Sitting in the small conference room with the reporter, David felt the weight of his words. He wasn't just a veteran anymore. He was a symbol of the struggles faced by so many like him. As the interview progressed, David shared his story, not just of the incident at Jeepers, but of the years he had spent struggling to adjust to life after losing his leg. He talked about Layla, the service dog who had helped him rebuild his life, and about the promise he had made to Michael Anderson. The reporter listened intently, occasionally scribbling notes, but never interrupting. When David finished, the reporter looked up from his notebook, his expression somber. "I think you've given voice to something many people never even consider," he said. "The treatment of veterans. It's not just about respect. It's about understanding." David didn't have all the answers, but he knew this much. The community needed to understand. They needed to see that service dogs weren't just pets, they were lifelines. He wasn't just asking for compassion. He was demanding respect. As the story spread, the reaction from the public was overwhelming. Some stood in solidarity with David, flooding social media with posts supporting his right to have Layla with him. Others were more critical, focusing on the discomfort some patrons felt at the restaurant. But the backlash was more intense than David could have ever imagined. The pressure on Jeepers restaurant grew, and the local veterans organizations rallied behind David, organizing protests and public demonstrations. Yet, it wasn't just the veterans who began to speak up. Sarah Anderson, Michael's widow and David's lifelong friend, stood beside him in his fight. She made it clear that the public apology from Jeepers wasn't enough. She wanted accountability, not just for David, but for every veteran who had been denied their rightful place in society after their service. She took to social media, sharing the story of how David had kept his promise to Michael, never missing a birthday, always showing up for Emily. The online reaction was swift, with veterans organizations nationwide taking to their platforms to share their experiences of similar discrimination. The hashtag Haiti Service Matters began to trend, and soon, other communities were speaking out about their own struggles with service animal accommodations. But as the protests grew in intensity, so did the pressure on Jeepers restaurant. The owner, Rebecca Collins, issued a public statement calling the incident a misunderstanding and offering an apology. However, many in the community, especially veterans, found her apology insufficient. It didn't address the deeper issues: why such a misunderstanding had occurred in the first place, and why it had taken so long for the restaurant to address it. A town hall meeting was quickly organized to address the growing controversy. The meeting would take place at the Sterling Heights Community Center, and both supporters and opponents of David's stance were expected to attend. David wasn't sure what to expect, but he knew it was time for him to be heard. The meeting was packed with local residents, veterans, business owners, and civic leaders. As David took the stage, his heart raced, but his resolve was stronger than ever. "I didn't ask for this," David began, his voice steady despite the nervousness clawing at him. "I didn't want to be in the spotlight. I just wanted to keep my promise to Michael. But I realized something. If I don't speak up, if we don't stand together, then what kind of message are we sending to those who have served this country? To those who have sacrificed everything?" The room was silent as David continued, his words cutting through the tension like a knife. "I'm not asking for sympathy," he said, his eyes scanning the crowd. "I'm asking for respect, for understanding, for the right to live my life with dignity, just like everyone else. Service dogs are not just animals. They're our partners, our lifelines. And I won't apologize for needing that." The crowd was still, processing his words. Then, a slow clap began at the back of the room. One by one, people stood up, joining in the applause. It wasn't just for David. It was for every veteran who had been overlooked or marginalized. It was a moment of collective realization that the fight for respect was far from over. David's fight wasn't just about one restaurant anymore. It was about changing how the community and the country viewed veterans and service dogs. And it was only just beginning. The town of Sterling Heights was no longer the quiet community it had once been. It was a place caught in the throes of change, driven by the events that had unfolded at Jeepers restaurant. What began as a single act of injustice against one veteran had evolved into a broader conversation about the treatment of veterans and the role of service dogs in their lives. David felt like he was at the center of a storm, one that had pulled in everyone around him. The media coverage continued to intensify, and each day brought more scrutiny. His every move seemed to be under a microscope. At times, it felt like his life had become a never-ending series of interviews, protests, and public statements. The pressure was relentless, and yet, there was something in it that kept him going, something deeper than just the fight for justice. It was the faces of veterans who reached out to him, sharing their own stories of discrimination, of struggles that had long gone unnoticed. The emails and letters from parents whose children had grown up learning about sacrifice but never fully understanding the weight of it. These people, these voices became his anchor. They were the reason he couldn't back down. But the emotional toll it took on him was immense. Every time he heard the stories of fellow veterans, it was as if he were reliving his own battles, his own trauma. The memories of the explosion in Afghanistan, the loss of his best friend Michael, and the subsequent years of physical and emotional pain flooded back in waves. It was hard to keep moving forward when the shadows of his past were always just a step behind him. One evening, as he sat on the porch of his apartment, Layla resting her head in his lap, David thought back to the promise he had made to Michael on that fateful day in Afghanistan. His friend's final words still echoed in his mind. "Promise me. You'll be there for her, for Emily." That promise had become his purpose, the thread that held him together when everything else seemed to be falling apart. But as the protests grew louder and the national conversation around veterans' rights reached a boiling point, David started to wonder if keeping that promise had become too heavy a burden. The day of the community rally arrived. It was scheduled to take place outside Jeepers restaurant, the place where it had all started. What was meant to be a peaceful demonstration quickly escalated into something more, as veterans from all over Michigan gathered to show their support for David and to demand that businesses like Jeepers change the way they treated service animals and veterans. David had never wanted any of this attention. He wasn't a hero, he told himself. He had simply been doing his duty, serving his country, and trying to keep a promise to a fallen friend. But as he looked out over the sea of faces gathered before him, he realized that this wasn't about him anymore. It was about all of them. It was about the veterans who had fought and returned to a world that didn't always understand them, the families who had been left behind, and the animals who stood by their side through it all. As David walked up to the makeshift podium set up for the rally, he was met with cheers and applause. But what struck him the most was the look in the crowd's eyes. Not just admiration, but a deep understanding. They had all been affected by the same wounds, the same struggles. And now, they had come together to fight for something more. David cleared his throat, his nerves getting the better of him. He hadn't expected to speak at the rally. He hadn't planned to be the face of this movement. But now, with the weight of so many eyes upon him, he knew he had to. "I never thought I'd be standing here today," David began, his voice steady despite the nerves. "But here I am, not just for myself, but for all of us. Veterans like me, and the service dogs who help us fight battles we can't see." The crowd grew quiet, hanging on his every word. For years, we've been told to just deal with it, to move on, to blend in. But blending in isn't an option anymore. Not when we're being told we don't matter. Not when we're told that the animals who help us live day to day aren't welcome just because they make people uncomfortable. David paused, his gaze sweeping over the faces before him. There were veterans from all branches of the military, older men and women who had served decades ago, young soldiers fresh from their own tours of duty, and families who had lost loved ones in wars long past. And in their midst was Emily, standing by her mother, holding up a sign that read, "Service dogs are heroes too." "I made a promise to a fallen friend," David continued, his voice thick with emotion. "I promised I would be there for his daughter, Emily, and I will. But I'm also here for all of you, for every soldier who came home to a world that didn't know how to welcome them, for every service dog who has been asked to leave, to sit outside while their handler fights alone." The crowd erupted into applause, and for the first time since the incident at Jeepers, David felt a glimmer of hope. This wasn't just about one moment of humiliation. This was about change. Real change. But just as the applause began to settle, David noticed something in the crowd, a woman approaching him. It was Karen Mitchell, the woman who had started it all, the one who had made the complaint that had led to his expulsion from the restaurant. David's heart sank. The crowd parted as she walked forward, her eyes focused on him. She wasn't holding up a sign of protest or anger. Instead, she had a look of deep sorrow on her face. She walked slowly, as though carrying the weight of something heavy, something David couldn't yet understand. As she reached him, Karen stopped and took a breath. "David," she said, her voice barely audible over the crowd, I owe you an apology. More than I can say." David stood still, unsure what to say. The weight of the moment was immense. He could feel the crowd holding its breath, waiting for his reaction. "Karen, David began, his words catching in his throat. "It's not about the apology. It's about understanding. Understanding that we all have battles, visible and invisible. And I don't blame you for what happened. I just want us to understand each other." Karen's eyes welled up with tears, and without a word, she stepped forward and embraced him. The crowd watched in silence, but for David, it was a moment of healing. A moment where the lines of division began to fade and understanding began to take root. As they pulled away from each other, Karen smiled through her tears. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for showing me that sometimes the biggest battles we face are the ones we don't see." The rally continued, but for David, something had shifted. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time in a long while, he felt like he wasn't fighting alone. The days after the rally were filled with a sense of quiet reflection. David's fight, once sparked by a simple moment of injustice, had now become a nationwide movement, a symbol of the unspoken struggles veterans faced every day. The rally outside Jeepers restaurant had been a turning point, not just for him, but for the entire community. And as the days passed, David couldn't help but feel a subtle shift in the air, as though something was slowly but surely changing for the better. The media coverage had died down somewhat, but the conversation it had sparked had only just begun. Local businesses were taking a hard look at how they treated veterans and their service dogs, and many were beginning to implement new policies that prioritized accessibility and understanding. Sarah Martinez, the former manager of Jeepers, had resigned, her own path of healing marked by the public apology she had made at the rally. The restaurant had also begun its own outreach program, working with local veterans organizations to provide a safe space for veterans and their service animals. But despite the progress, David couldn't shake the feeling of the deep scars that still lingered. The incident had opened wounds that had been buried beneath years of coping and survival. Though he had made great strides in his recovery, the emotional toll of the past few months weighed heavily on him. Every time he closed his eyes, he could still hear the voices in the restaurant, the whispered conversations, the hum of discomfort in the air. Layla, ever vigilant, sensed his unease. The bond they shared had deepened during the rally. It wasn't just a partnership anymore. It was a deep, unspoken understanding of one another's pain, resilience, and strength. She was there when his nightmares became unbearable, when the memories of war came rushing back. And she was there now, as a quiet reminder that healing was not a linear process. One afternoon, as David and Layla sat in the small park near his apartment, he watched a young boy playing with his dog nearby. The boy's laughter echoed through the air, and for a brief moment, David allowed himself to feel a sense of peace. A soft breeze stirred the leaves around him, and David took a deep breath, letting it fill his lungs. He hadn't realized how much he had been holding in, how much pain he had been carrying all these years. But now, as he sat in the park with Layla by his side, he could feel something shifting inside of him. Perhaps it was the community's support, or the realization that he had played a part in something bigger than himself. Whatever it was, it felt like a beginning, not an end. Suddenly, a familiar voice broke his reverie. "David, can I talk to you for a minute?" It was Sarah Anderson, Emily's mother, walking toward him with a gentle smile on her face. Her eyes were kind, but there was a depth to them now, a weight that hadn't been there before. Emily, clutching her favorite stuffed animal, trailed behind her. David smiled at Sarah. "Of course. What's on your mind?" Sarah sat beside him on the bench, taking a deep breath before speaking. I've been thinking about everything that's happened, and I just wanted to thank you again. For everything. David looked at her, surprised. Sarah, you don't need to thank me. I just kept a promise. Michael would have done the same for me. No, Sarah said, shaking her head. It's more than that. You didn't just keep a promise. You helped us see something. You helped us understand something we couldn't before. You gave us all the courage to face our own battles, even the ones we didn't know we were fighting. David looked down at Layla, who had shifted closer to him, sensing the shift in energy. I don't know about that. I'm just one guy trying to get through the day. But you're not alone anymore. David, Sarah said softly, none of us are. You've shown us the power of a promise kept, the strength in asking for understanding. We're all healing together in our own way. Emily, she's not the only one who has learned something important from this. Emily, who had been quietly listening, suddenly stood up and held out her hand to David. Uncle David, she said, her voice clear and confident, I know what I want for my birthday this year. I want everyone to understand how important service dogs are. And I want to tell everyone that they're heroes too. David blinked, momentarily caught off guard by the simplicity and wisdom in her words. Emily had only been 7 years old, but there was something in her eyes, something that had always been there. She was a part of this change too. Her heart, just as big and brave as any adult's, was the one that had started it all. David smiled, his heart swelling with pride. You've got it, kiddo, he said, his voice thick with emotion. As Sarah, Emily, Layla, and David stood together in that quiet park, David realized something profound. Healing wasn't just about overcoming the battles of the past. It was about building something new. It was about understanding, about compassion, and about acknowledging the things we sometimes wish to avoid. And in this moment, surrounded by the people who had walked this journey with him, David felt a sense of peace that he had never known before. Sometimes the best heroes have 4 legs, David whispered, his voice steady. And sometimes the strongest hearts are the ones that learn to love again. As they walked away, side by side, David knew the road ahead would not always be easy. There would be challenges, and there would be struggles. But he also knew that the strength he had found, both in himself and in his community, would carry him through. And, with Layla by his side, he would never be alone again. This story isn't just about one veteran's fight for dignity. It's a reflection of the struggles faced by so many who have sacrificed for their country. It reminds us that true healing requires understanding and compassion, not only for the visible wounds, but for the invisible ones as well. David's journey teaches us that even in the darkest times, there's hope for change, and through the power of connection, we can heal together. Sometimes, the greatest lessons come from the simplest moments, from a promise kept, a child's wisdom, or the unwavering loyalty of a service dog. Let's remember that our heroes are not just the ones who wear uniforms, but those who stand beside us, whether in battle or in everyday life, offering their strength and love. What did you think of this story? Have you ever witnessed a similar act of bravery or kindness in your life? Let us know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this story, be sure to subscribe to the Heart Force channel for more inspiring stories that will touch your heart.